So I want to welcome everybody to this is the fourth in our Sharing Plow Executive Lecture Series. It offers a forum in which national and international leaders in communication, business and media speak to our students in the MA in communication. The series is sponsored by an endowment given to Fairleigh Dickinson University from the Sharing Plow Corporation. It makes possible a lot of things. Very grateful for that. During the course of these lectures, students are given a unique opportunity to listen to and, more importantly, interact with some of the leading figures in our field. The broad theme of this lecture series is Uncertainty, Change, and Hope, the role of communication scholarship in understanding and affecting tumultuous times. It's important to consider what role communication scholars can play, both in terms of understanding the nature of these times, and also what we can do to change them through direct action and activism. So tonight's speaker is Dr. Deepa Kumar. He's a professor of media studies at Rutgers University. He's an award-winning scholar and activist. She's the author of more than 75 publications, including books, journal articles, book chapters, and also articles in independent and mainstream media. She's given over 20 keynote and plenary addresses at conferences around the world, including this one. Thank you. Dr. Kumar's work is driven by an active engagement with the key forces that define our era, neoliberalism and imperialism. She's recognized as a leading scholar on Islamophobia and empire, both nationally and internationally, and is part of the Media Education Foundation series on media, culture, and the Middle East, along with Edward Said and Jack Shaheen. Her book, Islamophobia and the Politics of Empire, is published in 2012, has been translated into several languages, and a second and fully revised edition, subtitled 20 Years After 9/11, is set to come out in September. And the title of Dr. Kumar's talk this evening is 20 Years Since 9/11, Terrorism, Race, and the Media. So I'm happy to turn the floor over to Dr. Deepa Kumar.
Thank you so much, Gary, for inviting me and for that generous introduction. It is my pleasure to be here and to share, I suppose, with you all the very first presentation of this new revised work. So you are the first audience to get new insights from the second edition. And I look forward to your comments and your questions following the presentation. All right, can you see my screen?
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Great. All right, so if you add up the cost of the war on terror, 20 years of the war on terror, it is tremendous, both in terms of lives lost, lives impacted and displaced, as well as dollars spent. So the Cost of War project at Brown University estimates that between 37 and 59 million people were displaced as a result of the US wars in 8 countries, and that around 800,000 have been killed due to direct war violence in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. Now, keep in mind that this is direct war violence. There are all sorts of deaths due to the consequences of war, such as the loss of infrastructure, right? So when roads get bombed, when hospitals get bombed, that's a problem. When people don't have access to adequate food and water, there are war-related diseases and a whole host of other issues. When those factors are taken into consideration, the human toll has been much higher. In fact, if you consider, before the war on Iraq, if you look at the sanctions that the US and the UN imposed on that country, just in the 1990s alone, over 1 million people died as a result of the 1990 Gulf War and then the sanctions that followed after that. At any rate, between 2018 and 2020, the US conducted counterterrorism operations in 85 countries and built 800 military bases around the world. That is, it didn't build these bases in those 2 years, it expanded to 800 military bases around the world. And all of this comes with a price tag of $6.4 trillion. Now, I can't seem to advance. So what I'm going to do is escape from this. Which I can't seem to do either. Not sure what's going on. Well, let's try this. Yay, good. So the war on terror basically rages on, exposing millions to what prison abolitionist scholar Ruth Wilson Gilmore has called premature vulnerability to death. Now, of course, when Professor Gilmore is talking about racism in these terms, what she has in mind is the Black and brown people who are the victims of the carceral state in the United States. But I think that that definition could very easily be applied to what the US is doing around the world in terms of the lives lost, the number of lives that I just mentioned. And basically, the idea of the brown terrorist menace has furnished the grounds on which to expand US global hegemony at the cost of attending to catastrophes such as the COVID pandemic, which has claimed far more lives than those lost on 9/11. 3,000 people were killed on 9/11. Over 500,000 have died as a result of the COVID pandemic and the botched response to it. And this number is far higher than the number of Americans who died during World War II. So if you think about it, really, if you think about it critically, the questions that we have to ask is, what are the priorities of our system? And why is it that we invest more in the means of death than in the means of life? Now, I want to speak specifically about anti-Muslim racism and how racism justifies and permits this kind of process, right? That is, how it is that anti-Muslim racism has provided the intellectual, the ideological cover to wage an endless war on terror, which costs trillions of dollars. Now, when talking about anti-Muslim racism, I want to argue a few things. First, the term Islamophobia is commonly used to talk about anti-Muslim racism. And I want to argue that Islamophobia is not religious intolerance, but anti-Muslim racism. That is, whereas religious intolerance explains the attitude, for instance, of certain sections of the Christian population during the medieval era, from the era of modernity onwards, really it is racism that characterizes the attitudes towards Muslims, Arabs first, and then Muslims second. Thus, anti-Muslim racism did not begin after 9/11, but has a much longer history. Anti-Muslim and anti-Arab racism are closely related to one another because Arabs have come to sort of stand in, if you will, for Muslims. The racial Muslim is a complicated category that is subject to change. It changes with changing circumstances. The post 9/11 racialized Muslim is an expansive category that includes everyone from West Africans, North Africans, to Arabs and South Asians. And anti-Muslim racism takes many forms. It is obvious, and we can identify the right-wing forms of anti-Muslim racism, right? Trump and the Trump administration was one of the most racist when it came to all groups, but certainly to Muslims. But it's much harder to identify liberal racism. So I'm going to speak a little bit about that and also flesh out a little bit about conservative racism. And finally, the book is called Islamophobia and the Politics of Empire, because my argument is that empire really is the crucible of anti-Muslim racism. So there are many dimensions to this, and I'll try to do justice to as much as I can, and you can ask me questions and make comments in the discussion section. First of all, what is race and how do I understand race and racism? I mean, the first thing to be said is that races don't exist. There is no biological basis for race. 40 years of research on the Human Genome Project shows that really there is no genetic basis for the idea of races. It's actually a completely arbitrary and artificially produced category, right? And if you think about it, right, why is it, for instance, that skin color, clothing, religious clothing, for instance, when it comes to Muslims, or the way your eyes look, or how your hair texture is, why are those the basis of race? If you think about it, you know, it's like, why don't we have another marker of human difference, such as height? After all, you know, there are tall people, there are short people. There are, you know, I'm sure in this very class, there are people above 5 feet 3 inches tall, and there are people below 5 feet 3 inches tall. I actually happen to fall on that cusp, which is why I picked that number. So we could potentially have the tally race, which is everyone above 5'3", and the shorty race, which is everyone under 5'3". But that's not how differences and human physical differences have been articulated. So the question is, when and why are races produced, and what aims do they serve? So race scholars Barbara and Karen Fields argue that races don't exist in some ahistorical manner, but are brought into being at particular moments to justify certain social, political, and economic projects. And they call it racecraft, right? They say it's basically a craft. It's like witchcraft. And it brings these groups of people that don't exist in any real sense into being as a race. Similarly, sociologists Michael Omi and Howard Winan call this racial formation. And they argue that race is unstable, flexible, and subject to constant conflict and reinvention. In other words, races once made don't endure. They keep changing because of changing historical circumstances. I'll give you a quick example. During the era of slavery, African-American slaves, for instance, were constructed as these simple characters, these docile characters, Uncle Toms or Uncle Remus and so on, just very happy to be slaves and so forth. Now, after the end of slavery, after the Civil War, you actually, and particularly after the end of Reconstruction, you start to see this image of the Black rapist come into being, right? Frederick Douglass theorizes this, and you know, other scholars have also talked about it, which is that free Blacks now come to be seen as a threat to white womanhood, right? And it becomes a justification for the Ku Klux Klan to then go out and lynch African-American men in particular, but also women. So there are changing ways in which race is constructed: simpleton, threat to white femininity, and so forth. Now, historian Patrick Wolf puts it this way. He says, race is a process, not an ontology, that it is not a state of being, it is a process that is related to the historical circumstances. It's a process of racialization that is at work. All right, so that said, in my book, Islamophobia and the Politics of Empire, I define anti-Muslim racism as both an ideology as well as a set of practices rooted within the political economy of empire. Empire creates the condition for anti-Muslim racism, and Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism in turn sustains empire. So where does the whole story begin? Where do we start in this narrative? Now, first off, I want to argue against some scholars who see anti-Muslim racism beginning with the Crusades. Certainly that was a period where there was awful propaganda about Islam. There were terrible stereotypes about Muslims who were then called Saracens. But that is not racism, I argue. Really, it was a form of religious intolerance, and the modern idea of race did not exist at that time. Instead, my argument in the book is that in medieval Europe, Christian universalism meant that there were no permanent races, right? Races of people marked by permanent difference and inferiority did not exist at the time, that is, in the Middle Ages. Now, what is Christian universalism? Essentially, it's the notion that all people, no matter what their religion, can be absorbed and appropriated into Christianity, provided they convert, right? So one medieval preoccupation was with monsters. They believed that everybody who lived beyond the known borders of a society was a monster. So you see in some of the French literature of the time in the 12th century that anybody who's beyond the borders of what they considered France at that time was a monster, which means the English were monsters, the Germans were monsters, and so forth. But suffice it to say that this is how people thought at that time. But Christian universalism meant that these monsters, you know, the Indians were considered monsters, Africans were considered monsters, and so on. If they converted to Christianity, their difference would be erased and they could become part of the Christian brotherhood or sisterhood, right? So that kind of attitude, and by no means was this universal, you know, at certain points you can see a fudging of this kind of universalism, but by and large, because of Christian universalism, there was no race in the form of a permanent difference marked by inferiority. Instead, notions of race come into being in the era of modernity. So the early modern era, which is from 1500 to 1800, you see the first biological notions of race being developed first in relation to Jews and then to Muslims. So these blood purity laws, limpieza de sangre, were used to disenfranchise Jewish professionals. So in the era of Isabella and Ferdinand, these were the monarchs who actually finished what was called the Reconquista. They took over and kicked out Muslim rulers from the Iberian Peninsula in 1492. And at that time, interestingly enough, there were a lot of Jewish people within, you know, ecclesiastical offices, within professional settings and so forth. In fact, Ferdinand himself had Jewish roots. But slowly what happens is that the old Christians who want to gain these offices and who want to benefit from Spanish exploration of the New World and all the loot that they found there, right? They found gold, they found silver, and so on. They were the ones who pushed for these blood purity laws to say that even if Jews converted, their blood was still tainted, right? Their blood was still marked and they could not be trusted. Therefore, they should not be given these offices. So it was really a struggle for power that pushed these blood purity laws. And the laws were first applied to Jews who were expelled from Spain in 1492. And then they were applied to Muslims, particularly to Muslim converts, who were eventually expelled in the early 1600s. Now, this was not yet a full-blown form of racism because Muslims and Muslim converts were not uniformly seen as inferior. In fact, even the Jewish population was not seen as inferior at this point, which is why I call it proto-racism. Now, the question is, why were Muslims not seen as inferior? Well, it's because Spain existed right next to powerful North African kingdoms and the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire was one of the most powerful empires at the time. And you see this actually in Don Quixote's, in the novel, Cervantes's novel, Don Quixote, there is a chapter on this Muslim convert, a Morisca, they were called Moriscos and Moriscas, in which she's dressed as a Turkish ship captain, and she's captured, and she's going to be hanged, and she's got a noose around her neck and so forth. And the viceroy shows up, and he finds her to be so handsome, so bold, and so striking, right? He's looking at what he thinks is a Turkish man, and he's just moved by his appearance. And then he says, okay, allow her to speak, and let's see what she has to say, or rather what he has to say. And then she tells her whole story about how she was exiled and how she left her treasure behind, her father's treasure, and she wants to go back to Spain. And she tells this story so charmingly and movingly that everyone is moved to tears. And in the end, the viceroy says, no, we have to spare her life. And not only that, he invites her and her father to his house, and all the people of the village come to meet with them and greet them and so on. And you think about that for a second, right? This is a moment of ethnic cleansing, mass expulsion. That's when Don Quixote was published. And yet you have this Morisca character with whom we empathize. So it's a very contradictory way in which this is operating. And by no means is this character seen as inferior, and neither are the Turks for that matter. So the Ottoman Empire, there are contradictory images in Europe at this time. In popular literature, they are depicted as cruel, violent, fanatical in ways that, have long been held in certain circles about Islam. But most educated Europeans in the 16th century were in awe of the immense power and wealth of the Ottoman Empire. And Sultan Suleiman was actually called the Magnificent by Europeans. There was also great admiration for their court system, for their system of justice, and so on and so forth. Keep in mind that Europe was still largely in the backwaters at this moment, right? If you look at, the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages are the period after Rome declines, the fall of Rome, and then from the 10th century on, Europe starts to grow. They're a tiny backward little place with no significance compared to the Ottomans, compared to the Indians, the Chinese, and so on. It's only with the rise of mercantile imperialism in the 16th century that Europe becomes a force to be reckoned with. So you look at English attitudes at this time in the early modern era towards the Turks, that is the Ottomans. Scholar Nabil Matar, who's written extensively about the subject, says that whether they were seen as ally or enemy, the Muslim was always constructed as equal, right? They were viewed on par with England in the political and cultural spheres, if not as superior to European Christian states. And there was no notion in this early modern era of colonization. So Queen Elizabeth, he says, cooperated with the Turks of the Ottoman Empire, with the Moors of the Kingdom of Morocco. The Moors was the term given to Muslims in North Africa and those who occupied Spain. And there was never a sense that, England would go out and colonize them. Why? Because England was not in a position to do so. It was not powerful enough to challenge the powerful Ottoman Empire. And certainly there was no notion that Turks were outsiders. In fact, even when the Ottoman Empire begins a period of decline, they are known as the sick man of Europe, right? So they're seen as Europeans of a sort. Now, the Renaissance, which is a movement that begins in Italy in the 14th century and then takes off, through the rest of Europe in the 15th and 16th century, then leads to the Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th century. What are these movements? They're basically movements that advance scientific thinking, rational thinking, and it's basically informed by a rejection of religious dogma, which was what was characteristic of the medieval era. In this context, Islam was considered impartially, even sympathetically, and many authors actually wrote treatises defending Islam against medieval intolerance. And in the 18th century, the Muslim East was seen through fraternal and understanding eyes. They were not singled out. Muslims were not singled out as being different, as being radically different, much less inferior to other people. At the same time, what's important about the Enlightenment is that people like Carl Linnaeus and Johann Friedrich Blumenbach began to typify and characterize human beings into various typologies, right? Now, by doing that, they didn't necessarily mean to create racism, but it laid the framework from which modern racism, based on physical typology, could actually emerge. In other words, Christian universalism was replaced with a scientific or humanistic universalism, but there was still respect at this stage for non-European civilizations and people. Now, don't get me wrong, scholars who've studied race and the Enlightenment say that there were people who were outright racist from our perspective. There were those who were anti-racist and those who were neutral. But it was there was no consistency in how people elsewhere were looked at. And broadly speaking, Enlightenment universalism, which is the idea that we're all human beings, we all share certain characteristics and so on, was the dominant thinking of the time. Now, something changes in the 19th century, and that is Europe finally emerges, particularly England, as if Spain and Portugal were the key mercantile empires, England emerges as the key capitalist empire in the 19th century. And Enlightenment universalism in the context of colonialism basically gives rise to an emphasis on difference between people and civilizations. In short, Europe developed what race scholar Etienne Balibar calls an imperialist superiority complex. And it is in this context that race, as defined by inferiority, not to mention physical characteristics, but also cultural factors, emerged in relation to Arabs, Muslims, and Asians, right? South Asians as well, because India is the supposed jewel of the British crown. Now, Orientalism means a lot of things, and scholars agree that there is no one single Orientalism, because if you look at Orientalist art, for instance, it changes. It's, historians, for instance, will argue that it's just as much about denigration as it is about praise in written work, in paintings, and so forth. But I think if you look at institutional racism, which Orientalism, you see that it was a mode of governance that actually was based fundamentally on very racist ideas, particularly this idea of Homo Islamicus, which is that Muslims are a subspecies of the species Homo sapiens, right? So institutional Orientalism was a mode of government that was premised on a civilizational view of history, meaning all of us are part of certain civilizations. Europe is a civilization that has its roots in Greece and Rome and has developed in a particular kind of way. Muslims are a particular civilizations, the Indians, the Chinese, et cetera, and there were characteristics associated. The West is advanced and democratic, it was believed, while the East is static and barbaric. And one of the premises on which these arguments were made is the notion that all cultures, all civilizations, if you will, have an essence that defines them across time, right? So you can say that X people behave like this, Y people behave like that, and so forth. And that essentializing modality of explaining people is a central feature of racism, right? Such an essentialist view of Arabs and Muslims generated a notion of Homo Islamicus, which is a species that can be defined by a handful of characteristics. And it was not just Arabs and Muslims, but South Asians, considered Orientals, who were also part of this mix. And it is at this time that Rudyard Kipling wrote his famous poem, White Man's Burden, which is based on the notion that the white man has a burden to go off and civilize colonized the, the dispossessed, the benighted masses, and uplift them and so forth. In fact, in this poem, if you've come across it, he has one line where he calls the colonized half devil, half child, right? And what that invokes is essentially the idea that on the one hand, they are demonic. They are not like us. They are fundamentally different, and they must be controlled through violence. On the other hand, they are childlike and must be uplifted by the civilized, British, because Kipling is British. So let's take a look visually at Orientalist painting. This is a painting by the famous French Orientalist Delacroix, and it is called The Death of Sardanapalus. And if you look at it for a few seconds before I say anything, you might notice some characteristics about it. I think the first thing that our eye goes towards is the woman on the bed. She possibly is dead or in the process of dying. We also see another woman in the foreground being tortured by a slightly darker skinned man with a turban. We see his other slaves similarly treating other women poorly. We see a black slave here being cruel to a horse. And the image that comes across is that this is a scene of just the most intense and horrific violence that's going on. And all along, this man, who we are led to believe is Sardanapalus, the ruler, is just sitting back with his head propped on his arm, looking on like as if it's entertainment. He's unconcerned by the violence. He seems to be entertained. And from this, we get the view of Muslim men as being brutal, violent, misogynistic. This painting actually visualizes a notion known as Oriental despotism, which is that the despot is all powerful, tyrannical, and cruel. And we also get the notion that Muslim women are horribly oppressed and must be rescued by the West. In fact, this becomes a standard theme in the 19th century, as historian Leela Ahmed has argued many decades ago, that colonial feminism really becomes a justification for British as well as French occupation of countries around the world. So let's look a little more at this gendered construction. Now, I said earlier that if Rudyard Kipling, talked about half devil, half child, I think we can talk now about half terrorist, half victim, with the woman being the victim, right? And this is another very famous painting from the 19th century by Gérôme, and it's called The Slave Market. You see here the slave owner, or at least the slave marketer, who is holding the robe of this woman who has been disrobed. And the richer man, we know he's richer because of the garments he's wearing, the fact that he has a retinue. We know he's a little poorer because of the garments he's wearing and his skin color, right? They are fairer skin, they are darker skin. In fact, in a lot of paintings, skin color becomes a way in which class is represented. At any rate, this is an image of humiliation. The woman is being examined like she's a horse. The man who's about to buy her is looking at her teeth. And for a Western person seeing this painting, it invokes horror about how horribly Muslims treat their women. It invokes also a sense of superiority, that we do not treat our women this way, that we are not as barbaric as these people, therefore we should go off and rescue them. Never mind, of course, that at this time in England, women had absolutely no rights. They didn't have the right to own property. They themselves were actually the property of their husbands. At any rate, the argument I make is that two conditions were necessary for the production of Muslims as a race. One, actual colonial domination by Europe, the ability to defeat powerful empires, and two, free liberal societies. Remember that at the end of the 18th century, you had the American Revolution, you had the French Revolution, which brought to fore ideas of democracy, equality, fraternity, and so forth. How do you justify colonialism then in denying these rights to colonized people? Well, you do so through the language of racism, which says that they don't deserve these rights. All right, so now I want to switch gears to colonial and antebellum America. First of all, much since colonial America was really a British colony, even though the French and the Spanish also had dealings and had territories in North America, it was really a British settler colonial operation. It was British ideas that really dominated both in the colonial era as well as after the Revolutionary War of Independence. Now, the first significant group of Muslims in colonial America were West African people who were enslaved, right? They were the first numerically significant group of Muslims in this country. But this was not, however, their religion was not the basis of their persecution. In fact, enslaved West African Muslims, because they were educated, occupied an in-between or a liminal space between Black and white, as scholars have shown. White Anglo settlers also brought with them from Britain attitudes about Islam, that is, Islam as a construction rather than, the reality of the religion and its adherents, from their experience with North African Muslims and from their experience with the Ottoman Empire. Now, attitudes, interestingly, developed about the Turks became interchangeable with Native Americans, right? Both were seen as savages in this context. So really, race does not have a boundary. Race making does not have a fixed boundary, tightly, sort of policed boundaries. But how one group is racialized informs how another group is racialized. You see this right through history. I'll give you one other example. When the soldiers who were responsible for these so-called Indian wars at the end of the 19th century and the final sort of, conquest of Native American territory, the attitudes that they held about Native Americans, as well as the racist attitudes that they held towards African Americans, they would take with them to the Philippines, where they would call Filipino people savages, or they would use the N-word to describe them. So that's how processes of racialization travel. And the methods used for one group is used for another group as well. Now, after the formation of the United States, as I said earlier, the British language was inherited. Colonial and Orientalist language was inherited as an ideology. However, it was not paired with systems of oppression, right? There was no particular way in which Muslims were targeted for being Muslims in the way that they were after the late 1960s. You read the Terrorcraft piece, and certainly not after 9/11. There were also all sorts of contradictory opinions towards Arabs as well as towards Muslims. So for instance, the abolitionists who wanted to end slavery in the United States saw the example of various Muslim kingdoms, Tunisia, the Ottomans, who ended slavery. And they said, oh my gosh, we're going to use that to shame the supposedly civilized United States into ending slavery right here, right? The temperance movement, the don't drink alcohol movement, similarly pointed to the Muslims who don't, the religion does not encourage drinking, let us say, as a way to, shame Americans who were consuming too much alcohol. So these were used as examples to shame Americans. At any rate, in the 20th century, Arab immigrants and Black Muslims experienced racism. That is, Arab Americans who came to this country around the turn of the century, they were a small part of the larger flow of immigrants at that time. These people were called new immigrants, and David Rudiger has written about this in a book called Working Towards Whiteness, where you had Italians, you had Eastern Europeans, you had another influx of the Irish and so on. All of them were considered to be non-white, and they were denied citizenship. And Arab immigrants, who were mainly from Syria, experienced the same kind of discrimination when it came to citizenship. Black Muslims had it much worse. In the 1930s, they were targeted by J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI, particularly the Moorish Science Temple Association. They were surveilled, they were persecuted, they were thrown in jail, and so forth. So really, this is a 20th century phenomenon. However, these ways of targeting Arabs as well as Black Muslims were part of older systems of white supremacy. And in the book, I argued that a new project of racial formation begins after World War II, when the US takes over the reins of the Middle East and North Africa from Britain and France. Now, the US is very keen to present itself as being completely different from the old colonial powers, right? So Secretary of State John Foster Dulles said of the Suez Crisis, this is when the Egyptian ruler Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalizes the Suez Canal, and France, Britain, and Israel, I'm sorry, not Italy, attacked Egypt. And the US actually intervenes and says, back off, right? Because the US is trying to displace these former colonial powers and is using its muscle after the Second World War. And this is what Dulles says: the British and French have done, what the British and French have done is nothing but straight old-fashioned variety of colonialism of the most obvious sort, right? So the US and the political elite don't want to be associated with this form of colonialism. In fact, there's a very positive view of the US in the Middle East and North Africa at this time. And the US crafts a new model of imperialism, what Melody McAllister has called benevolent supremacy, and was premised on the notion that an American-dominated world would ensure liberty and democracy for all through the mechanism of free market capitalism. This is also known as American exceptionalism, right? The idea that the Americans are not like the British, the French, sort of a beacon of liberty, democracy, and so forth. And Henry Luce, of course, talks about this as the new American century. Now, this new form of imperialism required a new language, and that language was called modernization theory. Area studies in the United States were dominated by this approach from the 1950s to the 1970s. Basically, as the US emerges as one of two superpowers on the global stage, right? There's the Soviet Union, there's the United States. It doesn't have any experience in the Middle East and North Africa. If it's going to dominate the world, it needs knowledge. And so the big three foundations actually sponsor departments and area studies programs to study the whole world and to provide knowledge necessary for imperial domination. Now, modernization theory is one of the key approaches that is used at this point, in addition to Orientalism, right? Because some of the old Orientalist scholars who were in Europe now move across the Atlantic when they see that the power has shifted to the United States. So, in area studies programs, you see Orientalists for sure, in Middle Eastern studies programs and so on, but you also see the emergence of modernization theorists. And it's based on the work of Max Weber, who distinguishes between traditional and modern societies. And for Weber, traditional societies are agricultural, they're rural, they're slow to change, they're politically authoritarian. On the other hand, modern societies are industrial, they're quick to change, they're politically democratic, they're egalitarian, and so on and so forth. In other words, They argued that change would not come from within this society, but had to be brought from the outside. Now, if you recall what I just said about institutional Orientalism, the method of coming to the conclusions may be different, but it is the same logic of Orientalism, right? Which is the idea that there are different civilizations. Some civilizations are advanced, some are barbaric. So it's the white man's burden to go off and civilize and colonize. Well, this modernization theory pretty much draws the same conclusion as Orientalism. So that's the starting point, if you will, of the racialization of Arabs, North Africans, and Muslims. Now, terrorcraft, and I'm going to go very quickly because I only have, I think, about 10 minutes at best. So the process by which Arabs and then Iranians are Muslims, and Muslims are turned into terrorists and against whom a war of terror is necessary is something that begins in the late 1960s. It then gets established as a framework in the late 1980s. And in the 1990s, South Asians actually come to be included in this racialized terrorist construction. Now, I want to make one very important point, which I also make in that essay, which is that there was no developed vocabulary about terrorism in the United States back in the 1970s. So if you look at this incident that takes place in Munich at the Munich Olympics, essentially a Palestinian group takes Israeli athletes hostage, and in the context of a rescue operation, murders all of them, right? And it's quite a grisly event. International media are already there to cover the Olympics, and they cover this, and this becomes worldwide news. This is how the British Sun represents it. You see here that the word terrorist is used because there was already a developed vocabulary in Britain, in the UK in this context. There wasn't so in the United States. There was no systematic framework prior to the 1970s. The New York Times did not include terrorism as a significant category before 1972. And you see that whereas in 1971, there were 0 articles that dealt in the New York Times with terrorism, by 1985, that figure had risen to 785. So here's the New York Times on the Munich massacre. 9 Israeli and Olympic team killed with 4 Arab captors as police fight ban that disrupted Munich Games. No mention of terrorism. Lots of words used, outlaws, madmen. Actually, President Nixon called them outlaws, not terrorists. Time cover, murder in Munich, not terrorism, however. But there is, of course, through the course of the late 70s and 80s, a process by which a systematic association between Arabs and violence in films like Black Sunday and so forth. Gary, do you think I should show this or just move on to the end? This is about a, I think, 4-minute clip. What do you think?
No, we have lots of time. I'd like to see it.
Okay.
The movies that we see basically follow Washington's policy. It's reflected in the cinema over and over again, particularly during the 1980s and the 90s, where you had perhaps 30 films which showed Palestinians as a people who were intent on injuring all Americans.
How may we help you, Jad?
One of the most despicable portrayals of Arabs and Palestinians occurs in the 1987 film Death Before Dishonor. First, they murder a guard and then slaughter an Israeli family. They kidnap and torture an American Marine, and in cold blood execute another. And they burn the American flag right in front of the American embassy, and then dispatch a suicide bomber to blow it up. One reason we've not been allowed to empathize with any Palestinian on the silver screen is due to two Israeli producers, Menachem Golan and Yoram Globus. These two filmmakers created an American company called Canon, and they released in a period of 20 years at least 30 films which vilify all things Arab, particularly Palestinians. They even came out with a film called Hell Squad, showing Vegas showgirls trouncing Arabs in the middle of the desert. I think the most effective film we've ever done, one of the most popular and most racist, is The Delta Force. Here, Palestinians hijack a plane and terrorize the passengers, especially the Jewish ones.
Pick out the passport with Jewish names.
There is no form of communication more powerful than film in creating propaganda, and Golan and Globus took it to another level. Certainly American producers play a role in vilifying Palestinians. I mean, perhaps the most anti-Palestinian film is True Law.
This apparently is the same group which just detonated a nuclear bomb in the Florida Keys.
Crimson Jihad will rain fire on one major U.S. city each week until our demands are met.
This film is shown on television almost every week, over and over again. It is part of our visual heritage.
Give me the key. Come on, child. You don't want to die, do you? Give me the key. And you won't get hurt. I give you my word.
No way, you wacko!
And we never see Palestinians who suffer under occupation, Palestinians in refugee camps, Palestinians who are victimized, who are killed, innocent Palestinians. These images are denied us. Now, why are they denied us? Is there an unwritten code in Hollywood saying we cannot and will not humanize Palestinians? I mean, why can't we humanize Palestinians in the same manner in which we humanize Israelis? Is not the life of a Palestinian child, media-wise, Hollywood-wise, politically-wise, as important, as humane, as valuable as the life of an Israeli child? And if the answer to that is yes, why can't we see that on silver screens?
Okay, so that was a clip from Real Bad Arabs. And the person speaking is media scholar Jack Shaheen. Jack has studied over 1,000 Hollywood films from the era of black and white films without sound up until 2014, I believe, which was when the third edition of Real Bad Arabs came out. And what he finds is overwhelmingly that there are stereotypes, even though there are some sympathetic portrayals. And certainly Palestinians have been, constructed as terrorists. It's not to say that there aren't Palestinians who take to political violence, or that there aren't, groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda who have committed atrocities and killed civilians. The argument here is that the vast majority of people who live in North Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia do not turn to political violence. In fact, one very comprehensive study done by a counterterrorism analyst, a former CIA officer, shows that in 10 years after 9/11, there were barely a handful of attacks or plots in the West instigated by Muslims. In fact, his figure comes down to less than 1 in 1 million Muslim in the West is involved in either an attack or just a plot that gets foiled. And yet overwhelmingly, that is the image that we see, and that is the image that drives the war on terror. Now, I was part of another Media Education Foundation documentary. If you want to learn more, you can check this video out. It's called Constructing the Terrorist Threat. And I said I would say a little bit about liberal, conservative, and reactionary anti-Muslim racism. There are various kinds. We can easily identify far right-wing anti-Muslim racism, right? That is the Muslim ban that Trump put into effect almost immediately after becoming president was obviously racist because he prevented people from 7 countries, Muslim majority countries, from coming to the US on the idea that they are potential terrorists. That's obviously racist. There are people in this Islamophobic network, it's a very well-funded network, that go around saying things like, 80% of mosques in the US harbor terrorists and teach violence. I mean, that's so obviously awful. But when it comes in liberal form, we don't recognize it, right? And liberal Islamophobia, and to some extent neoconservative Islamophobia, what they do is that they use democratic rights as a way to construct the Muslim other as being inferior, as being less than. So for instance, this idea of liberating Afghan women in the lead up to the war in 2001, that is a standard liberal principle that covers over how Afghan men are being presented as barbarian. It's not to say that Afghan women did not suffer under the Taliban, they did. However, they are capable of their own liberation. There were feminist groups arguing that we can liberate ourselves. We don't need bombs being dropped and just, the infrastructure being destroyed. Similarly, free speech becomes a way in which to articulate liberal racist ideas and persecution. And in the notion of good Muslim, bad Muslim is also liberal racism, right? The idea that bad Muslims are those who disagree with us, and good Muslims are those who agree with us. It's a form of imperial ethnocentric racism. And if you look at films like Argo, which is about the 1979 hostage crisis in Iran, Iranians are presented in exactly the same way that they were presented in 79, in the 80s and so on, as just, these crazy, violent mobs and so forth, hate America, etc. The only good Muslim is this woman who tries to help the hostages escape, right? Similarly, a film like Zero Dark 30, which is about the assassination of Osama bin Laden, everyone in Pakistan is suspicious. Everyone is, a bad Muslim. The only good Muslim is a translator who helps the Americans get to the place where Osama bin Laden is. So you get the idea that, there are blatant and then there are very subtle and manifest forms of anti-Muslim racism. So I'll come to a close with this, which is that if we understand racism as being historically produced, as being the product of certain social, economic, and political regimes, then we can actually work to end it, right? That is, if we don't see it as something encoded within the DNA of people who live in the West, then it is possible to actually end it. But it's a tall order. To end anti-Muslim racism, it will take more than education about Islam, more than education about anti-Muslim racism. It will take ending the war on terror, which is sustained by and sustains anti-Muslim racism. It will take dismantling the 800 military bases around the world and directing the trillions of dollars that are spent on the means of death to the means of life. So that is a huge project which involves social movements, that involves people getting involved and educated and educating others around them and standing up and fighting for the kind of world that we want to see, one based on respect for all people, regardless of religion, race, gender, gender identity, sexual identity, and so forth. That's the kind of vision that animates my work and my scholarship. And yeah, thank you for allowing me to share that with you. Sorry, I went on a little longer.
No, not at all. Not at all. Not at all. I want to open the floor to questions. So raise your hand, either physically or with that little raise your hand thing on the Zoom.
Yes, indeed, Gilmore, but I also cited Fields and Fields, who are also Black scholars and who I draw from, as you saw in the racecraft, I mean the Terrorcraft piece. Terrorcraft is a play on racecraft. Thank you for that, Martha.
Caitlin.
Hello, thank you for your speech, and your talk was really insightful, looking into the history and the background of all of this. Kind of going off your last slide, and of course presentation as a whole, I kind of wanted to ask that it obviously took a long time to create these ideas, you know, dating back to when you showed the paintings, and even before that, like this has been in the process of creating this horrible idea for so long. I know you said that there's a possibility in the future for it to be undone or untaught, or just even framed in a different way. But I wanted to ask, like, how long, since it took so long to get to this point, how long would it take to reverse it? And then even then, if it is reversed against, in the light of Muslims, will it be shifted then to another culture? Will it just be passed around cultures, or will it ever truly go away?
Yeah, that's a great question. Is it Catherine?
Caitlin.
Caitlin, thank you, Caitlin. So first of all, ideas don't exist in a vacuum, right? That is, racist ideas exist because there is power that actually backs it up and is able to institutionalize it, and that's able to exploit, oppress, or expropriate various groups of people, right? So the first encounter with Native Americans in this country wasn't hostile. In fact, even when African slaves, West African slaves, were brought to colonial America, it was not as if they were immediately seen as inferior or anything of that sort. It's only in the context when land was needed from the native people and they fought it, that's when they become racialized. It is only when white indentured labor is no longer as easily available from Britain because of the Industrial Revolution and all the surplus population that was earlier sent off to the Americas to be the settler colonial force. When those people dry up and those indentured servants are not available to work on the plantations, and when there's a rebellion of white indentured servants, of Black slaves, and so on, Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia, that's when chattel slavery is instituted in the law and anti-Black racism begins to get formed. Similarly, there are no systems of oppression against either Black Muslims or Arabs for much of US history. It's only in the 20th century that Arabs who come to the United States get caught up in the same white supremacist sort of framework that Italians, that Irish, that Eastern Europeans, that Jewish people all get caught up within. But then they get accepted into whiteness, actually. They're able to successfully fight the legal cases, and they're able to gain citizenship in after 1917, I'm sorry. They start winning their cases for citizenship and are, sort of treated as white by the legal system. It's not to say that they don't experience all sorts of discrimination in the interpersonal realm, but there are differences there too. So there's discrimination against brown-skinned Syrians, whereas richer, fair-skinned, white-skinned Syrians don't experience that, right? So all this is to say is that things keep changing. In fact, some Arab American scholars say that they were so assimilated, Arab Americans were, that they would have completely lost their Arab American roots if it hadn't been for US interests political and economic interests, particularly oil, in the Middle East, which begins the new project of racialization. So I say all that because these ideas always are driven by political and economic projects. So right now, what's going on, and this speaks to the last part of your question, there, at least since the Obama era, there's been an attempt to what Obama called a pivot to Asia, which is that China has become and is being seen as the key sort of political threat to US interests, right? The neoconservatives who were in power during the George W. Bush administration have actually been arguing this all the way since the early 1990s. But it was not taken that seriously until the 2000s, when China starts to be seen as this emerging threat to the United States on the global stage. So when COVID hit, it's not a coincidence that Trump would call this the Chinese virus, right? It's completely within the realm of trying to demonize a whole people that US aggressive posture against China is acceptable. So that's the motivation, which is that when things shift in those ways, it is because there are political and economic factors at play. And what any anti-war movement should do is to challenge and question these racisms and say that, you know, we don't benefit in the least bit from this. And the anti-Vietnam War movement did that fantastically well and succeeded. They were one important factor in ending the Vietnam War. There were all, of course, it was the struggle of the Vietnamese themselves, as well as soldiers in the US military who refused to continue to fight, who exposed the racism, who exposed the lies and so on, and who are coming back and joining the anti-war movement. That ended eventually the war in Vietnam. So those are some lessons to be learned, which is that there are always racist lies. I'm sorry? Okay, there are always racist lies about people seen as the enemy, because otherwise most people, whether it's Americans or British or whatever, just don't want to kill other people, you know? It's not in our DNA as human beings. I'm not saying that there aren't, like, you know, toxically male guys who want to go around shooting everyone and so forth. But for the most part, you have to be desensitized and the enemy has to be dehumanized in order to carry out war. And I think, you know, today our task is to do the same, is to expose the lies of the war on terror and to show how racism and racist dehumanization is costing us a bundle. Right? Think of that money. All of you would have no college debt if we didn't spend trillions on the war on terror. We would have a free healthcare system where all of us would have vaccinations, and I would possibly be there in person talking to all of you. But, you know, those are not the priorities because people are not organizing, fighting, and demanding that those be the priorities. Please go ahead.
James.
Hi, Dr. Kumar. You talked about changes in language whenever there is a new imperialist or political or economic objective, the language changes to accomplish those objectives. When I read historical documents about Muslims written by Americans, I'll find different terms are used. So they're not called Muslims or Islamists, they're called Muhammadiyans, for example. Can you talk about some of the changes in language in American history regarding Muslims as their place in society supposedly has changed?
Yeah, absolutely. So chapter 2 takes this up in the new revised edition of my book, Islamophobia, which goes from the colonial period all the way to the 20th century. I'm sorry, the 21st century. Yeah. And first of all, medieval language is not present in the United States, right? So in chapter 1, I talk about the names given to Muslims by Europeans. It's Saracens first, It's Moors for people, for the Muslim empires that take over the Iberian Peninsula and for North Africans, and it's Turks for the Ottoman Empire. The word Islam did not exist and was not used until about the 17th century. Muslim similarly. Instead, Mohammedan was the term that was used, as you correctly pointed out, James. So in colonial America, there are scholars who have, looked at how Islam, the religion, as well as the Turkish Ottoman Empire was looked at. And they're very derivative discourses when it comes to how people view this. They borrow very directly from how the English and the British actually talk about this. But there's also some interest in this religion, and there are some dispassionate studies of not Islam, Mohammedism, right? And then you start to see travelers, travel writing. Before that, after the new American nation is formed, around the turn of the 18th century, the start of the 19th century, there is a massive demand for captivity narratives, right? What's happening at that time is that British and American, but more British sailors are being taken captive by what's called the Barbary Coast. These are Muslim kingdoms in the north of Africa. And they're being taken as slaves, right? So white slavery becomes a big deal. And, people want to know what's going on. We want stories about this. So there's a huge demand in the publishing industry, not only for Barbary Coast captivity narratives, but also for Native American captivity narratives, right? Native American captivity narratives, Richard Slotkin writes about. It's fascinating to read his account. Often what would happen is that white women would run away from very oppressive familial situations and go live with Native Americans voluntarily. But it becomes a matter of honor for white guys to go off and rescue them and, kill the Native Americans and so forth. But that's not the question you asked me. So Barbary Coast captivity narratives. These were fantastically popular stories, right? People were just eating them up. This is like what's a fantastically popular television show these days? Whatever it is, I don't know. But so how about have people seen that chess show with this young woman, Queen's Gambit? I think everyone's seen that, right? I hope. If you haven't, you should. It was a really entertaining and fun watch. So it was like the Queen's Gambit, if you will, of that period. And these stories are all about these awful Moroccan and Tunisian pirates and rulers who are taking these innocent whites, British and American sailors, and turning them into slaves. And then most of these stories would have this white guy escaping and coming back to show how superior Americans are. And ironically, while white slavery was being denounced, American slavery of West Africans, of Black people, silence, right? Or justification in these novels. Only a tiny minority of these novels actually condemn it and draw a parallel that slavery in general is wrong. So those are some stories in the popular media at the time, which is, that these Moors, these pirates, these barbaric people, these Muslims and so forth behave this way. But it's very contradictory. Timothy Marr has a book on this where he shows that there's no one view. Every sphere has a different articulation. So if the American nation comes into being saying, we are the bastion of democracy, we are everything that the Ottomans are not. They are Orientalist despots. We are, exactly the opposite. They are Muslim, we are Christian, and so on. That's the view among the political elite. But regular people have all sorts of other views, right? They're reading Arabian Nights and they're fascinated by this romantic notion of flying carpets and genies and magic lamps and all sorts of things going on. Romanticism had a very interesting view of the East, which is in some ways positive, in some ways negative. You have travelers going off to the Middle East and seeing that, it's not as bad as we thought, or it's just awful. So Mark Twain, for instance, would write a book called Innocents Abroad, in which he would completely denounce people in the Holy Land as barbaric, uncivilized people and so forth. But then other travel writers write good accounts. The temperance movement is positive, the abolitionist movement is positive, and so on and so on. So it's complex and it's quite contradictory in terms of how Americans view the Middle East, view Arabs, view South Asians, and view North Africans. Last thing I'll say, and maybe I'm saying more than you asked for, if so, forgive me, is that Melanie McAllister, the scholar, American Studies scholar, talks about how there's a process of commodity Orientalism that's at work in the late 19th and early 20th century. And what she means by this is that, you know how the settler colonial population was very sort of Puritan in its values. They would save everything. They didn't believe in consumption or conspicuous displays of all sorts of gaudy things and so on. Now we've entered industrialization. We have mass-produced goods. There's a need for a base. And so advertisers try to create in the American public a desire to go off and buy things. And one way they do that through storefront decorations, through ads and so on, is to appropriate images of Orientalism from Europe, of wealth, of splendor, of sexual liberation, of sexual exploration, all sorts of fantastic things, which then get associated with particular commodities like curtains, like rugs, silk curtains, and so on and so forth. And so there's a way in which they are trying to get Americans to identify with people, with Orientals, and to treat themselves to these luxuries and escape their Puritan ethics. So it's just all over the place.
Thank you. We have an very old copy of the Innocents Abroad here in the family office. And in fairness to Twain, he wasn't really a fan of any place that he traveled, it seems. But thank you.
It's true. And if you read it, he mocks American travelers with just as much sarcasm, right? He's like, these people, the American traveler is this loudmouth, demanding kind of traveler, which becomes the grist for Hollywood, for the Hollywood mill later on, right? The stereotype of the American traveler. And in his defense too, I will say that he becomes an anti-imperialist, and he's part of the anti-imperialist league, where he stands in sympathy with the Filipinos. He also believes that some people in the Middle East and Arabs are good people. If only they had access to riches and so forth, they would develop well. So he's a contradictory person too.
I see a hand. Elizabeth?
All right, I just wanted to say thank you, Dr. Kumar, for the lecture. It was like very eye-opening and all that. I just was like wondering about, from the first article you wrote about donning the veil. So I was wondering, do you believe that these women should have a voice? Why or why not?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that has been one of the sort of justifications, if you will, to the veil, rather, has been the means by which to demonstrate the oppression of Muslim women, right? The belief in the West is that they are forced to veil, they're not given a choice in this process, and so forth. Leila Ahmed talks about this in her book. And it goes back at least to the British occupation of Egypt at the end of the 19th century, where Lord Cromer, who is the colonial overlord in that situation, becomes obsessed with the supposed liberation of Muslim women. And he's particularly focused on the veil and the removal of the veil. Now, it's interesting how this man, Lord Cromer, who is the founder of the Men's League to oppose women's suffrage back in Britain, right? The feminist movement there is agitating for the right to vote. And Cromer is this chauvinist who is this, sexist who doesn't want that. He wants the good Victorian woman to know her place, which is in the home and not in the public sphere, would go off to Egypt and advocate Muslim women's emancipation. Why? Well, he's using feminist ideas developed in the British context to justify colonialism, right? To justify British colonialism. Now, how do Egyptian women respond to him? They say, all right, it's all very well to take off the veil, but if women do not have the right to education, if they do not have the right to property, if they do not have the right to divorce, if they do not have the right to hold a job, wearing or not wearing a veil makes absolutely no difference. And so they were demanding those kinds of rights. And in fact, Egyptian women were given access under Egyptian rulers to a very decent amount. I mean, those who could afford it, right? Middle-class Egyptians, to good education and so forth. And interestingly, Cromer actually curtails that and restricts education opportunities for Egyptian women. So it's not just the British, it's also the French who, when they met with anti-colonial resistance in Algeria, orchestrate these unveiling campaigns where essentially they round up the servants, the domestic servants of the white French who live in Algeria and who didn't have much of a choice in this matter. They round them up and they basically make them simultaneously take off their veil and say, oh, the French have liberated the Algerian woman, yay, yay, yay. In response, what Algerian women do who did not veil is they don the veil to protest colonialism and the appropriation of their culture by the French. And in fact, the veil is used both by men and women as a way to smuggle weapons, bombs, and things like that in the national liberation struggle. So essentially, scholars who study the politics of the veil have argued that there are all sorts of complex reasons why women wear the veil. Certainly, there are women who are forced by patriarchal fathers who insist that they, wear the veil and so on. But there are also all sorts of other reasons that women have: anti-colonial sentiment, in the current era, more women are wearing a hijab, which is the headscarf, in protest to say, you want me to remove it? Hell no, I'm going to wear it just to show that I have independence and I am making this choice. So there are all sorts of, ethnologists and ethnographers have studied all the complex reasons why women wear the veil. And certainly, even in Christianity, nuns choose to wear the habit. No one ever sees them as horribly oppressed, right? It's only Muslim women. I'll end with telling you my own example, which is that when I've traveled to many countries in the Middle East and North Africa. And during one of my trips to Egypt, to Cairo, I went on a tour of the pyramids. And our tour guide was wearing a headscarf. And I was sitting with her for most of the trip. So by the end, I felt like I'd gotten to know her a little bit better. And so I asked her, I said, why do you wear the hijab? Have you always worn it? What are your reasons? And she said, you know what, I never wore it before, but ever since I became a tour guide, you saw how breezy it is and how much sand gets kicked up in the pyramids, so that I don't have to keep washing my hair every day. I wear a hijab because, it just saves me from the bother. And I was like, wow, how interesting. So my position on this is the following, which is where women are forced to veil, such as in Saudi Arabia, such as in Iran. I support the right of women fighting against that and, insisting that the choice be theirs. Where women are forced to remove the veil, such as in public places and in schools in France, where there is a law, I support their right to wear the veil, to wear the hijab, because in the end, the agency has to be given to women to make that choice.
I have a short question, Gary, if I may.
Oh, please be my guest, Riyadh.
Thank you. I'm currently working or started to explore this issue of elite racism in the academia, the production of knowledge, the center of production of knowledge. What do you have to add to that issue? And in my view, I think this is one of the major forces of perpetuating racism in society and creating new images to keep up with the era, with the events or current events in any given time.
Absolutely. May I call you Riyadh?
You can call me Riyadh, that's fine.
So absolutely, Riyadh, I agree with you 100%, and I'll work backward in terms of answering your question, which is that the last chapter, the concluding chapter of my second edition, has what I call a matrix of Islamophobia, where I outline all of the key institutions that are responsible for both producing and circulating anti-Muslim racism. And at the top of the chart, I have the academy as one of the sources. I have others such as the national security state, think tanks, which are also a very important source of knowledge production, the political sphere, right, the dialogue of politicians and so forth. And then I have the media, the right-wing media, the left-wing media, the mainstream media. Finally, I have social movements, right-wing, left-wing, and so on. And they all interact with one another in a dialectical fashion to produce or to resist anti-Muslim racism. So in fact, right from chapter 1, I focus on the academic production, for instance, of Orientalism. I draw from existing scholarship, Edward Said, but also, a whole bunch of other scholars to talk about how Orientalism as a body of thought was instrumental in colonialism, right? But of course, Orientalism is contradictory. Hamid Dabashi, for instance, argues that there were Orientalists who were fierce anti-imperialists. And other scholars have also argued the same. So it's not a homogeneous body, but certainly that portion which is institutionalized was used, both to govern and to create laws in colonized societies, as well as to produce these racialized images. Now, Chapter 2, I focus on the production of knowledge in the American Academy after World War II, right? Area studies programs. And I draw actually from Osama Khalil's book, Dream Palace, where he actually, the entire book is about knowledge production of the Middle East. And he's written really beautifully about how American academics, particularly from the 1950s through the 1970s, produced instrumental knowledge for empire. But after the 1970s, thanks to the successful national liberation movements, right, all the way from India to Algeria and so forth, there is, as you know, a movement within Middle Eastern studies as well as other area studies programs to take on an anti-imperialist position. So whether it's Edward Said, whether it's Brian Turner, and a whole host of others, they challenge and tear apart modernization theory as well as Orientalism and start to produce a different kind of knowledge that really derives from these national liberation struggles. So what Khalil's argument is that think tanks then become the source of knowledge production. And certainly after 9/11, the amount of grant funding that is available through DARPA and so forth for this kind of instrumental knowledge has meant that a lot of academics have been sort of co-opted into producing knowledge that's useful for empire. Anthropologists, for instance, have talked about the human terrain system, where anthropologists were sent to Afghanistan to find information to better help the US occupation of that country. We held a conference here at Rutgers called The Professor and the Spy, with Hugh Gusterton, an anthropologist, and several other people, to basically say, what is the line between ethical scholarship that looks at what's actually going on the ground, and that takes a sort of humanitarian, humanistic approach, versus one that's funded by people with vested interests and that produces knowledge that can be used to oppress people and so forth. And I'm not saying the line is always clear. I certainly think that people can take grant money and use it for good purposes, but we have to really think about these things before we rush headlong to where the money is in order to fund this research. And I look forward to reading your work. That's excellent that you're working on this.
Thank you very much. I'm going to order your book as well. I'm reading, I read Islamophobia, written by a Pakistani scholar, and it was really very interesting. I'm not sure you're familiar with this book.
No.
Oh, you should read it.
I will.
It's very interesting.
That sounds
interesting. Yeah.
Hold off and wait for the second edition, which is coming out in September.
Okay, thank you.
Don't get the old version. The second edition is much better. I mean, it's a blessing and a curse when the publishing house says, sure, make as many edits as you want, because you're not the same person you were 10 years ago. And you know so much more, and you just want to change everything. Not that the first edition was, bad or whatever. It's just you want to keep adding and adding. And I added so much to it. It became 160,000 words, 60,000 more than what I was allowed. So then I had to cut it back and make some really serious choices. So it's a curse in that sense. And it's a blessing because now I have ideas for 2 further books in what will form a trilogy of books on this topic.
Well, I wish you good luck.
Thank you.
Ashwira.
Hello, Dr. Kumar.
Hi.
I wanted to first ask if you've seen the movie My Name is Khan.
I have not. Have you?
Yes, I have. It's a movie based on a Muslim man who wants to prove to his wife and the US that all Muslims are not terrorists because they were facing post 9/11 prejudice.
Mm-hmm.
Just as you showed us examples of Muslims being portrayed as bad people on television, do you believe projects like this movie, My Name is Khan, is a step towards the right direction in ending this racism towards Muslims? And do you think this would have the same type of impact on people as past projects did?
Right. Gosh, who is in the film? It's Shah Rukh Khan, is it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, so having not seen the film, having just read reviews by it, I do think that, all films that try to expose racism in general are worth seeing because they go against the grain and, they are useful to that extent. But what I remember is that Shah Rukh Khan was traveling to the US to promote the film. And he was stopped, I think, at JFK. And he was searched and he was detained and subject to all the things that, Muslims are subject to at the border. And he is livid and comes out and does a press conference about exactly the thing that the movie is trying to expose. So I think that in combination with the film, I can't really speak about the film. I should watch it, but I can't really speak about the film. But I do think that his real life experience legitimated the idea that Muslims are targeted in this way and how deeply problematic that is. By the way, for those of you who don't know Bollywood films, Shah Rukh Khan is like a mega, mega, mega superstar. He is in, all sorts of hit films. So I don't know if you watch Bollywood films, Aishwarya, but I'm sure you would have seen many films with Shah Rukh Khan.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. But that is not to, of course, take away from Bollywood's own anti-Muslim racism, because India, under the BJP, under the Modi government, has become extraordinarily racist. I mean, this has been a process that has gone on for the last few decades, but has seen the pinnacle in the form of this fascist government that is targeting Muslims in all sorts of horrific ways. And I myself grew up in a city called Bangalore, which is in the south of India. And our neighbors on both sides of the house were Muslim. My parents are Hindu. I myself am not religious. And, you know, we celebrated Hindu festivals and Muslim festivals together. And there wasn't this kind of animosity that there is today in India, which is really horrific. It, you know, it tells you how these sorts of things are constructed, cultivated, and pushed to a point where even people who I know should know better, educated people, are spouting propaganda and racist ideas. And I just don't know what to say to them, because back when I was growing up with them, that is not how we were with each other. We had Muslim friends, we had Christian friends, and we certainly, you know, didn't behave in these sorts of ways. I mean, I'm not saying that India has not always had a problem with racism against Muslims, but it was certainly not as dominant as it is today.
Andy.
Hey, Dr. Kumar. I have a question about the sort of like with basically the my premise of my question is like basically last year the top headline is COVID. So with the past year, our focus has been on what COVID being the big story, no longer terrorism, which it was for so long. Is there going to be any? Do you foresee any changes or anything that, you know, either media portrayals or any real world policy changes, knowing full well last week we just launched an airstrike against Syria? Is there any hope at this point, I suppose, is my question, or is there going to be you see any things in the works now that terrorism is no longer the leading story in this era?
Right. So the answer to that is complicated, and I'll try to take on various parts of it. Which is that COVID is the story because, you know, it's taken over all of our lives. It's taken over our ability to function as people. So obviously it's going to lead in the mainstream media. That said, I believe that what has happened is that terrorism and terrorcraft as a way of thinking has become so entrenched and so much part of the unconscious that there's no need to keep repeating that again and again, right? So in fact, by 2010, there's a study that came out that showed that on the top television shows at the time, the majority of terrorists were white people, not Muslims.
Really?
So you look at the first season of Homeland, and it is a white man, a military guy, who converts to Islam and becomes a double agent and, you know, takes the side of the Afghan people. So there's a way in which in the Obama era, multiculturalism, multiracialism becomes the way in which to keep terrorism alive through dog whistle tactics. So sure, we'll have DHS, you know, videos. There's this one called The Drop Off, which looks, if you look at that DHS is Department of Homeland Security. If you look at that video, it's one of their most popular videos. It looks very much like the show 24. I don't know if you're familiar with that show 24. It's, you know, quick action. It's this guy who is always trying to avert a terrorist plot. And you have these split screen images, right? Where something is going on one side, something else is going on, and you have a timer at the bottom because it all happens within 24 hours. Mm-hmm. This ad is exactly like that. It has these split screens, it has a timer, and so on. But interestingly, in the era of multicultural imperialism, all of the good guys are people of color, African Americans, someone who looks South Asian, and so forth. And all the bad guys are white women and white men. So what that does is it keeps the threat alive. It's, it's shot at a train station and it's telling people you see something, you have to say something, right? It's a ritual, it's a security ritual that basically keeps terrorism alive without naming the terrorist as a brown person, because we all know it, right? We don't have to say it anymore. Similarly, after the civil rights movement, right, the Republicans no longer use the N-word, right? That was gone. Instead, they talk about states' rights. They talk about busing. They talk about education. So these are the same kind of dog whistle. Once something is entrenched, right, such as the association of brown men, particularly, and to a lesser extent, brown women, it's not necessary to repeat that again and again. That said, if there is a big attack by ISIS or somebody else, that is going to receive massive attention. That's another security ritual that keeps us engaged in the war on terror. Because if we didn't have that, how do you justify that the US in just 2 years was involved in counterterrorism operations in 85 countries around the world? How do you justify maintaining 800 military bases around the world? It's by keeping Americans scared, right? This threat could happen at any point, you could die, blah, blah, blah. There are these bad guys all around us. And in that way, it's not that different from the Cold War. Your parents' generation will know of this ritual called, a security ritual called duck and cover, right? Where,
help much if there's a bomb.
exactly. Kids would be taught, right? A siren would go off and kids would be taught, duck underneath your desk because a nuclear bomb is about to explode. Like a little desk is going to protect you, as you just said. But it's a security ritual that keeps alive a certain kind of threat. And everyone knows who the threat is. You don't have to say it. So in other words, that's part of the answer. Another part of the answer is that the US mostly has what it wants in the Middle East and North Africa and South Asia, in the sense that there are dictatorial regimes that do their bidding. Saudi Arabia does mostly what the US wants to do. The Egyptian dictators do what the US wants to do, and so on. If it wasn't for these thorns like ISIS and all sorts of other forces, the US would have moved on from that region. In fact, from about 2014, they've been trying to move on to China, to pivot to China, but they can't do it because there are constantly people who are averting their agenda in that region, including the democratic people's movements called the Arab Spring, which ousted many of these US-friendly dictators. So they wind up, the US government, when I say they, I mean the US government, I mean the political elite, I don't mean ordinary people like us. Most of you are probably US citizens or residents or what have you. We are never consulted about these decisions, right? There are two Americas. There's the America of the elite, and then there's the America of the ordinary people, right? Of the MLKs, of the Rosa Parks, of the, of the women's suffrage movement and so on, who are always pushing back against power. And so they're stuck in that region and will be stuck at least until they're able to get rid of, these sorts of thorns. And that's also useful from a propaganda perspective, but China really is being seen as the main threat. So don't be surprised if you start to see more and more, yellow peril kind of rhetoric beginning to appear again, just as it did in the late 19th century when Chinese were, the Chinese Exclusion Act, when they were denied citizenship and seen as a huge threat and so forth.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, Roger.
I think somebody called Brianna also had a hand.
Yeah, Brianna had her hand up first.
Okay. Go ahead, Brianna.
Hi, how are you? Thank you for your speech today. So my question is regarding media's role in terrorcraft and racism. So in your presentation, you went back, you highlighted historical stereotypes in art, and I thought that was really powerful to see it way back in time. And then also in the terrorcraft article, you spoke on how news media plays a pivotal role in terrorism. So I think the media highlighting racism and terrorism is a twofold issue sort of deal, because it's important to bring it to the forefront and inform Americans on what's going on, but then in the same breath, as you see those violent images and things like that, it ingrains an image in your head. So I wanted to know your philosophy on media, media's role in terrorcraft and racism.
Absolutely. So television, scholars have already, you read the piece, right? So I've cited media studies and communication studies scholars who have done research, particularly on television's role, right, as an audiovisual media form in constructing the terrorist threat. But there isn't that much research on newspaper, portrayal. And so when I went in to do, at least at the time that I did it, and certainly there are more studies since then, I was expecting to find, okay, 1972 is when the New York Times first indexes terrorism. Probably there's going to be a whole bunch of people who are associated with terrorism in the 1970s. And indeed, you read that in the article. But in the 1980s, particularly after the Iranian Revolution, it would be overwhelmingly Muslims. It would be overwhelmingly Arabs. I didn't find that. We downloaded every single article with the word terrorist in the headline. And that was not the case in the 1980s too. It was all sorts of people who were considered terrorists. So I start with that to say that I want to push back in the book I'm calling Terrorcraft against the notion that somehow there was always this association between terrorism and brown people. No, it was a long and messy process. And the media are not monoliths, right? So Dobkin, who studies ABC, Bethany Dobkin, finds that even in the 1980s, although television is sort of disproportionately covering Arab terrorism, they're also covering Latin America, they're covering all sorts of parts of the world in the 1970s and 80s. When a bombing takes place in Lebanon, they don't immediately use the word terrorist because it's not yet a fixed framework. It's not yet a fixed narrative. It happens after a few days. And then in the expanded version of the essay that you just read, what I also argue is that they're looking at, how the culture of poverty is used to talk about Black poverty in the US. They're talking about the culture of poverty in terms of Puerto Rican disenfranchisement. In other words, blaming people of color for the situation that they're in. This is the backlash to the civil rights movement and the Puerto Rican independence movement and so forth. They borrow that language to say, there's a culture of terrorism in the Middle East. So it's very interesting how all these racisms intermingle in all sorts of ways and how different media outlets present it differently. Television is very different from the New York Times. So I try not to homogenize the news media. And I'm also going to be studying Hollywood, which has a different, idiom altogether than news media. So I hope to present a more nuanced, understanding, because there's a tendency, in our field, even though we have rejected the effects model of communication research. I don't know if you've come across that, but it was the first social scientific model which said hypodermic needle. The media are so powerful that it's like a needle, put some ideas in your head, monkey see, monkey go do. It's not. And the ways in which the elite, the media, resistance, people, think tanks, and all these institutions react to one another is far more complicated. And I think it's important to look historically at what is happening at a particular moment, what explains this at this moment, why does it change at this moment, how does that then change back at another moment, right? So it's important for media scholars, for communication scholars, not just to study media and communication, but to study historical, political, social, and economic context, because that's how we explain change. Now, it's not easy, it's hard. It took me 4 years to write the Terracraft piece because it was so multidisciplinary, and it went through 7 drafts before I finally got it to where it is, and I still don't like it. I'm going to change it as I write the book, because again, I'm learning more.
Sydney?
Hello. I actually want to ask you about something we were talking about before you joined us this evening. We were talking about how on January 6th, there was the attack on the Capitol, and now it's kind of being debated what to call it. Like, do you call it terrorism, or is there something else? So I kind of wanted to get your opinion of that, as well as if we do call it domestic terrorism, like, how do you think that will change how we view terrorism in this country?
That's an excellent question. First of all, we should separate, I think, the criticism of the hypocrisy, right? Which is to say that white supremacist, neo-Nazi, and far right-wing groups, we know, commit more violence than jihadist groups, than Muslims, and so on. That has been well documented, well studied, and so forth. But when you think of the word terrorism, it's a brown person, typically a brown man, that comes to mind, right? Do a Google search. You'll see the kind of images that come up. I've done this not only on my computer, I've done it on other people's computers. I've had them do it. I've done it in England, in France, in Australia. And it's not my computer's algorithm and Google sort of figuring out what I want to see. You can do it on your own, and you'll see it's overwhelmingly brown men who come up, you know, turbaned, bearded, carrying a gun, and so forth. So that term terrorist is overwhelmingly associated with brown men. So I think it's absolutely right to call out the hypocrisy of that, to say, why isn't Michael Wade Page, who shot up and killed Sikhs at a Gurdwara in Wisconsin, in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, that's terrorism, right? Why is he not called a terrorist? Why is the young man whose name I'm forgetting, who carried out the attacks on the Black church in North Carolina, what is his name?
Dylan something.
Dylan Roof.
Yes.
Dylan Roof. Why is he not called a terrorist, right? So we can absolutely point, South Carolina, thank you very much. So we can absolutely point to these sorts of people who commit acts that meet the very definition of the term terrorism. But if you look at the differential media treatment, to go back to Brianna's question, whereas when a Muslim commits an act of political violence like this, immediately today, it's called terrorism. But when a white person, a white man in particular, does it, it's let's look at his psychological background. Let's see what happened to him. Why did he do this? How? Because certainly we're not going to generalize to all white people and call all of them terrorists, right? Instead, there's a lone wolf theory of white terrorists. And there was a really funny cartoon in The Onion where these two wolves are talking to each other and saying, they're giving us a really bad rap by comparing these nasty white supremacists to us, you know, don't call them lone wolves, we're better than that. So all of these sorts of theories are advanced when it comes to a white person because of racism, right? So Albert Memmi has this term called the mark of the plural. He, in his book, Colonizer and Colonized, where he says the actions of minoritized groups, of racialized groups, become generalized to everybody in that group, right? So when 9/11 happened, all Muslims somehow were to blame and had to apologize. Whereas when Timothy McVeigh carried out the attacks on Oklahoma City, white people didn't have to apologize, right? White men were not profiled in the way that Muslims have been profiled. I mean, the profiling is intense. You should read chapter 6. It's not just surveillance, it's infiltration into mosques. It is the recruitment of informants. It is the sending of agents provocateurs into community spaces, into student groups, and so on and so forth. One scholar, Arun Kundanani, compares the targeting of and surveillance of Muslim Americans to the Stasi in East Germany. That's the extent of it. So if you know anything about how repressive East Germany was and the secret police was and so on, that's the experience for a large number of Arab and Muslim and South Asian Americans in this country. Great documentary called The Feeling of Being Watched. Watch it to get a sense of what it feels like to be a suspect population just because you look Muslim or you are Muslim or what have you. It's, anyway, I don't have time. I go into all the ways: preemptive persecution, material support for terrorism, blah, 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 all the ways in which, there's a double standard. And in fact, in the original chapter 6, and even now, I've drawn on lawyers and legal scholars who've made a comparison to how just in a court of law, a Muslim immigrant could have, he or she could have simply stayed on past their visa. But if by some chance they are found to be carrying a Quran when they are captured, or if by some chance they own a gun, immediately that becomes a terrorism case. Whereas white militias that own guns in the thousands and that train all over the United States in training camps and so forth, Second Amendment rights, they're allowed to do it. Nobody profiles them. In fact, until very recently, I believe 2 or 3 years ago, the FBI did not, surveil these folks. In fact, one of the things that the riot on January 6th taught us is how many people from the military and how many current police officers were involved, right? So if we're expecting the police and if we're expecting the military to police these white supremacists, forget it, because there are many people in their ranks who actually have sympathies with the Proud Boys and so forth. So that's one part of the answer. We should point to the hypocrisy, the double standards and so forth. Should we call these people terrorists? No. Because, why? Because what that will do is strengthen the powers, strengthen the policing powers of the national security state, not to be used against white militia and neo-Nazi groups and so on, who, I mean, look at their treatment. These men and women stormed the Capitol, put their feet up on Nancy Pelosi's desk, rampaged, and wrote threatening notes, and the police just let them depart. Did you see those scenes of letting them go? Do you think if Black and brown people had done that, they would have let them go? They would have gunned them down and they would have imprisoned everyone immediately, right? So what we learned from the Black Lives Matter movement is that strengthening the policing powers of the carceral state is not a good thing, because it will disproportionately be used against dissidents, against Black and brown people, against even white people. So counterterrorism policies that were originally designed to be used against Muslims were used against Occupy Wall Street activists, right? Were used against environmental rights activists and so forth. White dissidents are also targeted by these same laws. So I would say anything that strengthens the power of the national security state does not help people's movements, because it will be used against us disproportionately. Of course, they have jailed some of these white supremacists, and there are going to be court cases and so on, because this was just so, I don't know, shocking, out of control. But on a routine basis, who are the people who are killed by the cops? Who are the people who are harassed by the cops and so forth?
We have like 2 minutes. Does anybody want to ask a last question? Roger, there's Roger.
My God, have we used up all the time? It's just flown by.
It flies, doesn't it? Absolutely.
Does. Well, thank you for your talk, Dr. Kumar, and being in attendance with us. There's so much to talk about, and I have so many questions that I don't even know which one to ask, and it kind of pops. It's all about these connections that we're trying to do and make, right? So I'm interested in this one particular question, and I forget who just kind of hit on it. It might have been Sydney, but so here we have professors, academia doing all this research, and it's wonderful research, and you do years of research to get to this point, and you present this research, and you do wonderful meetings like this where it's that research starts to take root, and now we know what to do as a people, let's say, and even some of the politicians might be in attendance during these conversations and read some of the research from academia. My question is this: how do you get that research to be enacted when it's the empire who controls what comes your way? So how does that happen? I mean, yes, at a grassroots level, yes. But if we want real change to happen and where certain words can no longer be used, and I think we were talking about this a little bit last week where I mentioned to James where history is changing right before us with statues coming down that represent a certain meaning. So how do we get the empire to change and incorporate what academia and empirical research is saying that we should do, and people's hearts and souls are saying this is where we need to be?
That's a great question. What was your name again? Roger. Roger, thank you for that. That's actually a great way to end a meeting like this. So in some ways, if I had to plant somebody, I would have planted you to ask that question. It's perfect. So the first thing to be said about this is that empires are not invincible, right? Rome fell. Rome was an extraordinarily powerful empire. It ruled for 5 centuries over large swaths of the world. And Eastern Rome continued to rule in the Byzantine Empire, Eastern Rome, up until the Turks, ended their rule in the 14th century. So this was a fantastically powerful empire, but it did come down. And there are all sorts of theories for why it came down, internal, external, and so on. And I'm not going to go into those debates. My partner is actually reading those debates right now and telling me about them. But that's the first point, is that empire presents itself as invincible, but it is not. And I think we have to point to the moments of dissent, and we have to point to all the valiant social movements, not just in this country, but in Britain and elsewhere, that have actually been central to ending occupations, to ending wars, to ending political domination and the rest of it, right? So there is fraternization despite all the efforts to demonize the enemy. We know that there was fraternization, for instance, in the First World War, where soldiers in these barracks that they constructed were talking to each other and saying, why the hell are we killing one another when the wealthy people who are trying to conquer these various lands are laughing all the way to the bank and we are getting maimed and shot and killed? Why are we doing this, right? And soldiers are a very, very important part of any military effort. And it's thanks to the Vietnam War and what's called the Vietnam Syndrome that came after it, which was the mass American revulsion to sending our brothers, our sisters, our fathers, and our mothers to die in a war based on lies, that the US could not actually go into another country until 1990, the Gulf War of 1990-1991. In other words, people's movements, soldiers' resistance, the anti-war movement, the movement in Vietnam and so forth, which I said earlier was so important to actually holding empire accountable, shutting it down in its tracks and holding it, saying that, not in my name, this is not going to happen. But that was not the end of it. We know that empire has revived itself after 9/11 and expanded in significant ways. But I would still put my faith in ordinary people fighting back and making the connections between the war on terror and what's happening domestically. Since 1999, there has been a dramatic increase in what are being called deaths of despair, right? This is basically the term given to mainly working class white people who, because they don't have good paying jobs, lose their spouses, lose their families, lose their children, sink into despair, and either get addicted to opioids or wind up killing themselves. That number is alarming. It's in the tens of thousands every year, right? Why is that happening when we live in the world's richest country in human history? Why is it that so many people feel like they have no choice but to kill themselves because their self-respect has been taken away from them? So I really think that there are some fundamental class issues, whether you're white, you're brown, you're black, what have you. The Occupy Wall Street movement had a slogan: they are the 1%, we are the 99%. We do not benefit from their regime. I mean, the trillions of dollars that Bezos has made because of our reliance on Amazon, while he does not provide, a decent wage to his workers, while essential workers don't have healthcare, while, protective gear is not available to nurses who are on the front lines. These are massive contradictions between the American dream and its ideology versus the reality. And I think that all of the movements that are coming up, there were huge strikes by essential workers. There was the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement. There are all of these discontents that are beginning to come to the surface. And my own thinking is that they have to come together, just as they did in the 1960s. The anti-war movement, with the civil rights movement, with the gay liberation movement, with the feminist movements, because all these issues are connected, right? And when that starts to happen, we can actually together, fight for a different kind of society and a different kind of world. I write not simply as an academic, I write as a social movement activist. I have been in the thick of the anti-war movement ever since it began. And that's a real benefit to me, at least, because when you're in the movement, you learn what people are thinking. You learn what ideas are coming to them, and you learn how better to counter them, right? If you're not organically connected to movements for social justice, as I am to the union movement, as I am to the anti-war movement, as I am to the Black Lives Matter movement, you don't know how to make your arguments. And you write in these abstract, abstruse ways that nobody can understand, which I try to avoid. If somebody with a high school degree cannot understand what I'm saying, then I'm failing in what I do. And that's what I did with my first book as well. It was about the UPS strike, and UPS workers bought and read it, and actually were able to make some victories coming off it. They didn't understand everything, but they understood most of it. And I was part of study groups with them. So I'll end with this, which is that classes like this, which I understand talks about social movements, are super important, because study groups and teach-ins was so vital to teaching an entire generation of people in the 1960s about what's wrong and how to think critically, and most importantly, how to think for yourself, right? I always say in my classes, I'm not trying to get you to think like me. I want you to be a critical thinker and think for yourself. That's what my task is, right? And that's what social movements do. There's no power hierarchy. There's knowledge being produced, and teachers were challenged by their students, and they were all producing knowledge that ultimately aided in ending the Vietnam War, winning abortion rights for women, ending segregation in the South, and so forth. So empire is not invincible. And we as citizens of empire have the power to actually make a difference.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I was wonderful. Thank you very much. Both the formal part and the dialogue part.
I loved all your questions. You're all really bright and intelligent people, and you're really lucky to have Gary as a professor, because clearly you're engaging in these kinds of fantastically useful conversations. So
yeah, no, these are brilliant conversations, and we don't have enough of them. So I'm glad when we can have them. So thank you very much for your time and giving of yourself to us this evening, Deepa. We really, really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, and have a good evening, everyone.
You too. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Okay, so it's 8:38, so I will officially adjourn the class. And you know the drill. I'll really look forward to seeing your papers by this Friday. I'll read them this weekend. And again, I think the message is the same. You got to write from within, write from your heart. Don't write about what you think I want you to say, but write about what really struck you in this presentation tonight, where it's striking you in your own life, your own history, your own background, your own feelings, whatever it is. That's where you've got to write. That's not where you've got. That's where I would like you to write from, because that's ultimately where the knowledge is going to be. And I'm glad, last week's speaker and Deepa kind of reinforced that for me 2 weeks in a row. So I hope that was useful. You found that interesting, insightful, and I'll see you guys next week. I'll see you papers on Friday. Does anybody have any questions for me before we log off? Okay. All right. Good night, everybody.
Good night, Professor. Thank you.
Good night.
You guys are great. I always tell you that. I mean it.